Again at night, Mason heard the sounds of the approaching sea, the muffled thunder of breakers rolling up the nearby streets. Roused from his sleep, he ran out into the moonlight, where the white-framed houses stood like sepulchres among the washed concrete courts. 200 yards away, the waves plunged and boiled, sluicing in and out across the pavement. Foam seethed through the picket fences, and the broken spray filled the air with the wine-sharp tang of brine. Offshore, the deeper swells of the open sea rode across the roofs of the submerged houses, the white caps cleft by isolated chimneys. Leaping back as the cold foam stung his feet, Mason glanced at the house where his wife lay sleeping. Each night the sea moved a few yards nearer, icing guillotine across the empty lawns. For half an hour Mason watched the waves vault among the rooftops. The luminous surf cast a pale nimbus on the clouds racing overhead on the dark wind, and covered his hands with a waxy sheen. At last the waves began to recede, and the deep bowl of illuminated water withdrew down the emptying streets, disgorging the lines of houses in the moonlight. Mason ran forwards across the expiring bubbles, but the sea shrank away from him, disappearing around the corners of the houses, sliding below the garage doors. He sprinted to the end of the road as a last glow was carried across the sky beyond the spire of the church. Exhausted, Mason returned to his bed, the sound of the dying waves filling his head as he slept. "I saw the sea again last night," he told his wife at breakfast. "Quietly," Miriam said. "Richard, the nearest sea is 1,000 miles away." She watched her husband for a moment, her pale fingers straying to the coil of black hair lying against her neck. "Go out into the drive and look. There's no sea. Darling, I saw it. Richard!" Mason stood up and with slow deliberation raised his palms. "Miriam, I felt the spray on my hands. The waves were breaking around my feet. I wasn't dreaming." "You must have been." Miriam leaned against the door, as if trying to exclude the strange night world of her husband. With her long raven hair framing her oval face, and the scarlet dressing gown open to reveal her slender neck and white breast, she reminded Mason of a pre-Raphaelite heroine in an Arthurian pose. "Richard, you must see Dr. Clifton. It's beginning to frighten me." Mason smiled, his eyes searching the distant rooftops above the trees. "I shouldn't worry. What's happening is really very simple. At night I hear the sounds of the sea, I go out and watch the waves in the moonlight, and then come back to bed." He paused, a flush of fatigue on his face. Tall and slimly built, Mason was still convalescing from the illness which had kept him at home for the previous 6 months. "It's curious, though," he resumed. "The water is remarkably luminous. I should guess its salinity is well above normal. But Richard—" Miriam looked around helplessly, her husband's calmness exhausting her. "The sea isn't there. It's only in your mind. No one else can see it." Mason nodded, hands lost in his pockets. Perhaps no one else has heard it yet. Leaving the breakfast room, he went into his study. The couch on which he had slept during his illness still stood against the corner, his bookcase beside it. Mason sat down, taking a large fossil mollusk from a shelf. During the winter, when he had been confined to bed, the smooth trumpet-shaped conch, with its endless associations of ancient seas and drowned strands, had provided him with unlimited pleasure, a bottomless cornucopia of image and reverie, cradling it reassuringly in his hands, as exquisite and ambiguous as a fragment of Greek sculpture found in a dry riverbed. He reflected that it seemed like a capsule of time, the condensation of another universe. He could almost believe that the midnight sea which haunted his sleep had been released from the shell when he had inadvertently scratched one of its helixes. Miriam followed him into the room and briskly drew the curtains, as if aware that Mason was returning to the twilight world of his sick bed. She took his shoulders in her hands. "Richard, listen. Tonight, when you hear the waves, wake me and we'll go out together." Gently, Mason disengaged himself. "Whether you see it or not is irrelevant, Miriam. The fact is that I see it." Later, walking down the street, Mason reached the point where he had stood the previous night, watching the waves break and roll towards him. The sounds of placid domestic activity came from the houses he had seen submerged. The grass on the lawns was bleached by the July heat, and sprays rotated in the bright sunlight, casting rainbows in the vivid air. Undisturbed since the rainstorms in the early spring, the long summer's dust lay between the wooden fences and water hydrants. The street, one of a dozen suburban boulevards on the perimeter of the town, ran northwest for some 300 yards and then joined the open square of the neighborhood shopping center. Mason shielded his eyes and looked out at the clock tower of the library and the church spire, identifying the protuberances which had risen from the steep swells of the open sea. All were in exactly the positions he remembered. The road shelved slightly as it approached the shopping centre, and by a curious coincidence marked the margins of the beach which would have existed if the area had been flooded. A mile or so from the town, this shallow ridge, which formed part of the rim in a large natural basin enclosing the alluvial plain below, culminated in a small chalk outcropping. Although it was partly hidden by the intervening houses, Mason now recognized it clearly as the promontory which had reared like a citadel above the sea. The deep swells had rolled against its flanks, sending up immense plumes of spray that fell back with almost hypnotic slowness upon the receding water. At night the promontory seemed larger and more gaunt, an uneroded bastion against the sea. One evening Mason promised himself he would go out to the promontory and let the waves wake him as he slept on the peak. A car moved past, the driver watching Mason curiously as he stood in the middle of the road, head raised into the air. Not wishing to appear any more eccentric than he was already considered, the solitary, abstracted husband of the beautiful but childless Mrs. Mason turned into the avenue which ran along the ridge. As he approached the distant outcropping, he glanced over the hedges for any signs of waterlogged gardens or stranded cars. The houses had been inundated by the floodwater. The first visions of the sea had come to Mason only 3 weeks earlier, but he was already convinced of their absolute validity. He recognized that after its nightly withdrawal, the water failed to leave any mark on the hundreds of houses it submerged, and he felt no alarm for the drowned people who were sleeping undisturbed in the sea's immense liquid locker as he watched the luminous waves break across the rooftops. Despite this paradox, it was his complete conviction of the sea's reality that had made him admit to Miriam that he had woken one night to the sound of waves outside the window and gone out to find the sea rolling across the neighborhood streets and houses. At first she had merely smiled at him, accepting this illustration of his strange private world. Then 3 nights later she had woken to the sound of him latching the door on his return, bewildered by his pumping chest and perspiring face. From then on she spent all day looking over her shoulder through the window for any signs of the sea. What worried her as much as the vision itself was Mason's complete calm in the face of this terrifying unconscious apocalypse. Tired by his walk, Mason sat down on a low ornamental wall, screened from the surrounding houses by the rhododendron bushes. For a few minutes he played with the dust at his feet, stirring the white grains with a branch. Although formless and passive, the dust shared something of the same evocative qualities of the fossil mollusk, radiating a curious compacted light. In front of him, the road curved and dipped, the incline carrying it away onto the fields below. The chalk shoulder, covered by a mantle of green turf, rose into the clear sky. A metal shack had been erected on the slope, and a small group of figures moved about the entrance of a mine shaft, adjusting a wooden hoist. Wishing that he had brought his wife's car, Mason watched the diminutive figures disappear one by one into the shaft. The image of this elusive pantomime remained with him all day in the library, overlaying his memories of the dark waves rolling across the midnight streets. What sustained Mason was his conviction that others would soon also become aware of the sea. When he went to bed that night, he found Miriam sitting fully dressed in the armchair by the window, her face composed into an expression of calm determination. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Waiting." "For what?" "The sea. Don't worry, simply ignore me and go to sleep. I don't mind sitting here with the light out." "Miriam." Wearily, Mason took one of her slender hands and tried to draw her from the chair. "Darling, what on earth will this achieve? Isn't it obvious?" Mason sat down on the foot of the bed. For some reason, not wholly concerned with the wish to protect her, he wanted to keep his wife from the sea. "Miriam, don't you understand? I might not actually see it, in the literal sense. It might be," he extemporized, "an hallucination, or a dream." Miriam shook her head, hands clasped on the arms of the chair. "I don't think it is. Anyway, I want to find out." Mason lay back on the bed. "I wonder whether you're approaching this the right way." Miriam sat forward. "Richard, you're taking it all so calmly. You accept this vision as if it were a strange headache. That's what frightens me. If you were really terrified by this sea, I wouldn't worry, but—" Half an hour later, he fell asleep in the darkened room, Miriam's slim face watching him from the shadows. Waves murmured. Outside the windows, the distant swish of racing foam drew him from sleep. The muffled thunder of rollers and the sounds of deep water drummed at his ears. Mason climbed out of bed and dressed quickly as the hiss of receding water sounded up the street. In the corner, under the light reflected from the distant foam, Miriam lay asleep in the armchair, a bar of moonlight across her throat. His bare feet soundless on the pavement, Mason ran towards the waves. He stumbled across the glistening tide line as one of the breakers struck with a guttural roar. On his knees, Mason felt the cold, brilliant water, seething with animalcula, spurt across his chest and shoulders, slacken and then withdraw, sucked like a gleaming floor into the mouth of the next breaker. His wet suit clinging to him like a drowned animal, Mason stared out across the sea. In the moonlight, the white houses advanced into the water like the palazzos of a spectral Venice, mausoleums on the causeways of some inland necropolis. Only the church spire was still visible. The water rode into its high tide, a further 20 yards down the street. The spray carried almost to the Mason's house. Mason waited for an interval between two waves and then waded through the shallows to the avenue which wound towards the distant headland. By now the water had crossed the roadway, swilling over the dark lawns and slapping at the doorsteps. Half a mile from the headland he heard the great surge and sigh of the deeper water. Out of breath he leaned against a fence as the cold foam cut across his legs, pulling him with its undertow. Illuminated by the racing clouds, he saw the pale figure of a woman standing above the sea on a stone parapet at the cliff's edge, her black robe lifting behind her in the wind, her long hair white in the moonlight. Far below her feet, the luminous waves leapt and vaulted like acrobats. Mason ran along the pavement, losing sight of her as the road curved and the houses intervened. The water slackened as he caught a last glimpse of the woman's icy white profile through the spray. Turning, the tide began to ebb and fade, and the sea shrank away between the houses, draining the night of its light and motion. As the last bubbles dissolved on the damp pavement, Mason searched for headland, but the luminous figure had gone. His damp clothes dried themselves as he walked back through the empty streets. A last hang of brine was carried away off the hedges on the midnight air. The next morning he told Miriam, "It was a dream after all. I think the sea has gone now. Anyway, I saw nothing last night." "Thank heavens, Richard." "Are you sure?" "I'm certain." Mason smiled encouragingly. "Thanks for keeping watch over me." "I'll sit up tonight as well." She held up her hand. "I insist. I feel all right after last night, and I want to drive this thing away, once and for all." She frowned over the coffee cups. "It's strange, but once or twice I think I heard the sea too. It sounded very old and blind, like something waking again after millions of years." On his way to the library, Mason made a detour towards the chalk outcropping and parked the car where he had seen the moonlit figure of the white-haired woman watching the sea. The sunlight fell on the pale turf, illuminating the mouth of the mine shaft around which the same desultory activity was taking place. For the next 15 minutes, Mason drove in and out of the tree-lined avenues, peering over the hedges at the kitchen windows. Almost certainly she would live in one of the nearby houses, still wearing her black robe beneath a housecoat. Later, at the library, he recognized a car he had seen on the headland. The driver, an elderly tweed-suited man, was examining the display cases of local geological finds. "Who was that?" he asked Fellows, the keeper of antiquities, as the car drove off. "I've seen him on the cliffs. Professor Goodhart, one of the party of paleontologists. Apparently they've uncovered an interesting bone bed." Fellows gestured at the collection of femurs and jawbone fragments. "With luck, we may get a few pieces from them." Mason stared at the bones, aware of a sudden closing of the parallax in his mind. Each night, as the sea emerged from the dark streets and the waves rolled farther towards the Mason's home, he would wake beside his sleeping wife and go, out into the surging air, wading through the deep water towards the headland. There he would see the white-haired woman on the cliff's edge, her face raised above the roaring spray. Always he felt to reach her before the tide turned, and would kneel exhausted on the wet pavements as the drowned streets rose around him. Once a police patrol car found him in its headlights, slumped against a gate post in an open drive. On another night he forgot to close the front door when he returned. All through breakfast Miriam watched him with her old wariness, noticing the shadows which encircled his eyes like manacles. "Richard, I think you should stop going to the library. You look worn out. It isn't that sea dream again?" Mason shook his head, forcing a tired smile. "No, that's finished with. Perhaps I've been overworking." Miriam held his hands. "Did you fall over yesterday?" She examined Mason's palms. "Darling, they're still raw. You must have grazed them only a few hours ago. Can't you remember?" Abstracted, Mason invented some tale to satisfy her, then carried his coffee into the study and stared at the morning haze which lay across the rooftops, a soft leg of opacity that followed the same contours as the midnight sea. The mist dissolved in the sunlight, and for a moment the diminishing reality of the normal world reasserted itself, filling him with a poignant nostalgia. Without thinking, he reached out to the fossil conch on the bookshelf, but involuntarily his hand withdrew before touching it. Miriam stood beside him. "Hateful thing," she commented. "Tell me, Richard, what do you think caused your dream?" Mason shrugged. Perhaps it was a sort of memory. He wondered whether to tell Miriam of the waves which he still heard in his sleep, and of the white-haired woman on the cliff's edge who seemed to beckon to him. But like all women, Miriam believed that there was room for only one enigma in her husband's life. By an inversion of logic, he felt that his dependence on his wife's private income and the loss of self-respect gave him the right to withhold something of himself from her. "Richard, what's the matter?" In his mind, the spray opened like a diaphanous fan, and the enchantress of the waves turned towards him. Waist high, the sea pounded across the lawn in a whirlpool. Mason pulled off his jacket and flung it into the water, and then waded out into the street. Higher than ever before, the waves had at last reached his house, breaking over the doorstep, but Mason had forgotten his wife. His attention was fixed upon the headland, which was lashed by a continuous storm of spray, almost obscuring the figure standing on its crest. As Mason pressed on, sometimes sinking to his shoulders, shoals of luminous algae swarmed in the water around him. His eyes smarted in the saline air. He reached the lower slopes of the headland almost exhausted, and fell to his knees. High above, he could hear the spray singing as it cut through the coigns of the cliff's edge, the deep bass of the breakers overlaid by the treble of the keening air. Carried by the music, Mason climbed the flank of the headland, 1,000 reflections of the moon in the breaking sea. As he reached the crest, the black robe hid the woman's face, but he could see her tall erect carriage and slender hips. Suddenly, without any apparent motion of her limbs, she moved away along the parapet. His shout was lost on the air. Mason ran forwards, and the figure turned and stared back at him. Her white hair swirled around her face like a spume of silver steam, and then parted to reveal a face with empty eyes and notched mouth. A hand like a bundle of white sticks clawed towards him, and the figure rose through the whirling darkness like a gigantic bird. Unaware whether the scream came from his own mouth or from this spectre, Mason stumbled back. Before he could catch himself, he tripped over the wooden railing, and in a cackle of chains and pulleys fell backwards into the shaft, the sounds of the sea booming in its hurtling darkness. After listening to the policeman's description, Professor Goodhart shook his head. "I'm afraid not, Sergeant. We've been working on the bed all week. No one's fallen down the shaft. One of the flimsy wooden rails was swinging loosely in the crisp air, but thank you for warning me. I suppose you must build a heavier railing if this fellow is wandering around in his sleep." "I don't think he'll bother to come up here," the sergeant said. "It's quite a climb." As an afterthought, he added, "Down at the library where he works, they said you'd found a couple of skeletons in the shaft yesterday. I know it's only 2 days since he disappeared, but one of them couldn't possibly be his?" The sergeant shrugged. "If there was some natural acid, say." Professor Goodhart drove his heel into the chalky turf. "Pure calcium carbonate, about a mile thick, laid down during the Triassic period 200 million years ago, when there was a large inland sea here. The skeletons we found yesterday, a man's and a woman's, belonged to 2 Cro-Magnon fisher people who lived on the shore just before it dried up. I wish I could oblige you. It's quite a problem to understand how these Cro-Magnon relics found their way into the bone bed. This shaft wasn't sunk until about 30 years ago. Still, that's my problem, not yours." Returning to the police car, the sergeant shook his head. As they drove off, he looked out at the endless stretch of placid suburban homes. "Apparently there was an ancient sea here once, 1,000,000 years ago." He picked a crumpled flannel jacket off the back seat. "That reminds me, I know what Mason's coat smells of. Brine."